So we left off talking a little bit about the end of the PRI's dominance in politics in Mexico. And there was kind of this deal that was struck between Mexican civil society and the PRI for much of the early part of the 20th century, which was basically just that as long as things keep getting better economically, we can deal with the limited political rights and the limited ability to contest political ideas. But the moment that the economy started to falter in the early 80s, things got really dicey. And then things got worse in 85 with the massive earthquake that occurred. Um, Part of the reason why the earthquake was so devastating, I was trying to explain right at the end of the last video, has to do with the geology of Mexico City itself. Mexico City is built directly on top of the old lake bed of Lake Texcoco, which means that when you hit it with an awful lot of energy, the clay upon which the city is resting, the silt and backfill that filled in the lake, it is subject to something called liquefaction, where basically it shakes really, really hard. The liquid rises, the sediments sink, and buildings collapse. When you add that to the fact that Mexico City had really lax building laws with very poor central government enforcement of safety regulations, it led to the pancaking of buildings. Worst of all, it led to the pancaking of hospitals. The the earthquake struck in the middle of the day, and it actually struck right at the same time as shift change in most of the hospitals, which meant that you didn't just have one shift of doctors and nurses and first responders inside. You had two, because they were getting ready to change over. And so when the hospitals pancaked, which many of them did, it killed a huge number of first responders. It also cut off water access to parts of the city for weeks and months. It cut off electricity. This was devastating. It was absolutely the worst moment possible for such a disaster to strike. The economy was still not stable from the early collapse of the 80s, and this led to this total rejection of the PRI in the 1988 election. However, in 1988, the PRI candidate up for election was Carlos Salinas. And Carlos Salinas de Gortari. And he was not a popular figure. He had been involved in some renegotiations of structural readjustment loans with the IMF and the World Bank, which were necessary after the oil markets collapsed in the early 1980s. And so he was not a popular candidate. And the PRI, frankly, really could not legitimately win this national election. Not after the earthquake, not after the economic collapse. It was also the first election in which they widely used computers to tally the vote. And so on election night in 1988, all of the sudden, as the returns were coming in, se cayó el sistema. The system went down. The collapse of the system is essentially what that means. Se cayó el sistema. The system fell down. It collapsed. What they meant was that the computers crashed. And when they came back on, it appeared that Salinas had won the election, although so unfortunate, the individual tallies of the individual polling places could not be retrieved. It is widely accepted that Carlos Salinas and the PRI did not win the 1988 election, that it was widespread, comprehensive, fraudulent voting, as well as just fraudulent reporting that resulted in the PRI holding on to the presidency in 1988. That particular moment of outright fraud really enraged a lot of Mexicans. It became very, very clear to many people that the PRI was just going to start stealing elections if they didn't have the votes, and they didn't. So From 1988, then you wind up with the next major presidential election occurring in 1994. 1994 was also not a great year, okay? So from 1988 until 1994, there were a series of negotiations between the United States, Mexico, and Canada that would result in the signing of NAFTA, which would go into effect on January 1st, 1991. Now, that trade agreement, that free trade agreement, was potentially beneficial to some Mexicans. It was also absolutely devastating to some other ones. In particular, lots of indigenous people in Mexico were deeply concerned about NAFTA and its results, because what it would mean would be that their agricultural produce, like corn, would have to compete against American corn or Canadian wheat or whatever it was. And particularly with regards to American corn, the American government subsidizes the price of its corn to such an extent that it's very, very, very cheap. And this would make it cheaper for Mexicans to buy American corn from Nebraska than it would be cost effective for them to buy local corn from the farm around the corner. So on January 1st, 1994, a group of indigenous populations from south central, well, frankly, south, it's around Chiapas, South Mexico, the southern portion of Mexico, rose up against the Mexican state and seized control over a number of cities in their region. These people identified themselves as Zapatistas in reference to, of course, Emiliano Zapata and the Mexican Revolution. They formed the Ejército Zapatista de la Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Zapatista Army, and they refuse to acknowledge the existence of the Mexican state and are seeking and continue to seek full autonomy. That was also a really rough year, because in 1994, the presidential candidate for an opposition party, Luis Donaldo Colosio, was assassinated in March. And that pretty much solidified the notion that the PRI were going to win the election, even though they were massively unpopular. Hang on. Additionally, after the assassination of the presidential candidate, there was also something called the Mexican peso crisis, which occurred in December of 94. And this was basically where, as a result of economic choices made because of NAFTA, the Mexican economy started to experience a period of sudden and massive inflation. So the government tried to devalue the peso to try and limit concerns about their ability to pay back loans, to be able to deal with their bills and everything. Unfortunately, these actions backfired, and ultimately they defaulted on the money that they owed to other countries. Most especially, they defaulted on the loans that they owed to the United States. This caused a massive decline in the Mexican economy. And as a result, what you saw was a huge number of Mexicans who normally, could make a living. They weren't able to. And so therefore it shouldn't surprise you that in the year 1994, 1995, the number of people who migrated into the United States, both legally and without documentation from Mexico, increased by a huge amount because the economy in Mexico was so poor. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about the earthquake in 85, this right here is one of the major hospitals in DF. You can see that the construction was nowhere near strong enough to withstand the earthquake. Of course, there was just recently, unfortunately, another earthquake, bizarrely on the anniversary of the 85 earthquake, down to the day. it was still incredibly devastating in Mexico City. The geology of it is just not favorable to earthquakes. You have a lot of geologic instability and very, very poor sedimentation. But the death toll was far less this time because the building constructions are better, and because Mexico has yearly required earthquake drills just because of this particular quake. They practice evacuations of buildings in all around Mexico every year on the date of the 85 earthquake, and they're actually fairly well prepared for it as a result. This right here is a depiction of, these are photographs of the Zapatistas down in southern Mexico in Chiapas. The sign says, está usted en el territorio zapatista en rebeldia. Aquí manda el pueblo y el gobierno obedece. What that means is you are in the territory of the Zapatistas in rebellion. Here the people rule and the government obeys. And here's a depiction of some of the modern Zapatistas. Now, okay, so all of this led to massive political instability in Mexico in the late 1990s. And so what we see is in the election of 2000, in the presidential election in 2000, the PRI fails to win the presidency. Instead, a conservative politician from the north, Vicente Fox, wins the election. He is part of the PAN, the Partido Acción Nacional, the National Action Party. There are other parties also that successfully contest the presidency. One in particular is the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, the Democratic Revolution Party. The PAN is more... The thing about Mexican politics is that everything is a good shove to the left of American politics. Everything. Even the more conservative right-wing parties are still a good shove to the left, except in a few particular social instances. So Vicente Fox is a free market capitalist. He is, actually, he was a vice president of Coca-Cola and lived in Atlanta for a little while, which is why his English is so good. And he is, he's still very active politically in Mexico and occasionally gets into fights with our current president on Twitter. He is a fun follow for that reason. But as a result of the election of 2000, which was free, fair, and truly democratic, like, the Mexican state was very proud of its 2000 election, and rightfully so, especially considering how terrible the election of 2000 was in the United States. They kind of won in terms of the free, fair, and transparent elections there. As a result of the 2000 election, Mexico kind of was regained its status as a truly liberal democracy. It was redefined by outside groups, including the United States, as truly democratic. There were multiple parties. They contested the presidency fairly and openly, and there didn't appear to be significant fraud. And we have seen an increased amount of pluralism in Mexico since 1994. Now, the election of 2006 was more narrow. It was a highly contested election. The PAN candidate, Felipe Calderón, won the election, but by the narrowest of margins. In fact, the presidential candidate for the PRD, the Partido Revolucionario Democrática, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is commonly known as AMLO, he lost by a fraction of a percent, and in fact refused to concede the election and even held a ceremony in which he swore himself in as president. Now, this made him deeply unpopular with a lot of other political factions, and including today's political factions, because Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he is currently president of Mexico, and a lot of people still are not real happy about that stunt he pulled in 2006. But what we do see is that even though non-PRI parties start winning the presidency, the PRI still continues to dominate local politics. And that is still true. many, many, many local politicians and governors and state legislatures are dominated by the PRI. They're not irrelevant. You still have to pay attention to them. You still should know who they are. Now, unfortunately for Calderon, his presidency goes rather terribly as a result of the domination of narcotraficantes, narco traffickers, and the cartels. This leads to the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto, EPN, and the rebirth, potentially, of the PRI. I'm going to stop here. I have very little left that I want to talk about, and then we will move on.